UAA, College of Business and Public Policy.
Hello, I'm Dr. Darren Prokop, Professor of Logistics in the College of Business and Public Policy at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Welcome to my video interview with Ed Hendrickson, Senior Vice President and CFO of the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, recorded on May 6, 2019. Mr. Hendrickson, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you achieved your position of leadership at the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
So I think, for me, I was born and raised in Alaska and grew up here. This was my home, went outside for school, got my education, came back, and I started working in the investment field and quickly transitioned into the oil and gas arena. And in that capacity, I've been working on upstream issues, which are oil and gas development, exploration, and midstream issues. And about 7 years ago, I joined the TAPS organization. I'm a secondee, which means a loaned executive from ConocoPhillips to Alyeska, and I'm in the role there as the Vice President and CFO. And as part of that role, I get to actually draw on a lot of my experiences from my earlier years of how do you deal with financing, how do you provide governance to the certain operations, what's good goes into a good decision quality, and all of those things kind of come to bear in what we're doing right now with TAPS. So a little bit mostly about, in summary, it's being familiar with Alaska issues and dealing with a lot of oil and gas issues upstream of TAPS and helping connect TAPS to the upstream part of the business.
Mm-hmm. TAPS stands for specifically?
Trans-Alaska Pipeline System.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the word midstream. What does midstream mean in your business?
Midstream means the transportation leg that connects the oil fields on the North Slope to the markets on the West Coast. And that midstream, there's two major components there. There's the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. And there's also some North Slope pipeline systems that connect the fields into TAPS. And then there's the marine transportation business that picks up the oil from Valdez and transports it to the West Coast into the refineries.
What are some of the key facts and/or statistics we ought to know about the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company?
Well, Alyeska's got a relatively long history in some senses. So in 1968, the oil fields on the North Slope were discovered. Specifically, Prudhoe Bay was discovered. And very quickly, they started working on a development theme about how would they get those barrels to market. And of course, they landed on a pipeline and a marine transportation system. And so they formed the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. They formed a consortium, and they decided they were going to have a company construct, operate, and maintain TAPS. And so they formed Alyeska Pipeline Service Company. It was formed in 1970, and it has, at the time, it had 8 owners, and those owners aligned with the owners at Prudhoe Bay, and the ownership interests in Alyeska aligned with the ownership interest at Prudhoe Bay. So there was alignment, vertical alignment, if you will, between the fields themselves and the midstream assets. And so 1970, it's a privately held stock company. It had the 8 owners. Today we have 3 owners, BP, ConocoPhillips, and Exxon. And it's really set up as an undivided joint interest. They have joint governance responsibilities, but the pipeline is set up so that they compete against each other for barrels, attracting barrels into their space. We have about 2,200 to 2,500 full-time equivalent employees. That means Alyeska employees plus our contractors. Our Alyeska employees are about 700 or so, and the contractors make up the rest of our workforce.
And building on the 1968 discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay, I suppose also 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act would be a very important piece of your history as well. Could you say something about that act as it applies to you in the energy sector?
Sure. Well, that was a very important piece of legislation, and along with the Alaska Native Land Claims Settlement Act, very important because at the time, the land issues in the state of Alaska were not settled. When I refer to the time that oil was discovered on the North Slope, those land claims had not been settled yet. So the Native organizations really had concerns about that moving forward without settling these claims. And the claims originated back from when the U.S. government bought Alaska from Russia, so back in the 1800s. And those claims had not been settled for almost 100 years at that point. And so what ultimately happened was the Native organizations and the oil industry aligned together and lobbied Congress to settle those issues. And as part of that settlement, we had some things that were involved in the right-of-way agreement, which is essentially an agreement that allows us to cross state lands and federal lands and private lands. There's some requirements, and that's part of how we're regulated, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But that settlement of those issues was critically important to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline moving forward and getting built. One of the key components in there that deals with the Native claims was that on TAPs, we are required to have a minimum of 20% Alaska Native hire. And so that's one of the things we're very proud of, is that we've been able to embrace that as part of an agreement that we made back in the early 1970s, and have been able to bring that diverse feeling, the diverse interest, the diversity of thought, the diversity in their background, and bring that to bear on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. So we're very proud of that. Our Native partners on TAPs are a key element of what makes the Trans-Alaska Pipeline successful and Alyeska successful.
Yes, and proceeding along with history, so we have the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 71, and then in 1973 we have the oil shock. That also sort of was an impetus in getting that Pipeline Authorization Act in place, right?
Absolutely.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there is another story. That this is, obviously Trans-Alaska Pipeline is probably riddled with wonderful stories and twists and turns in history, and that's a really important one. At the time of the discovery of Prudhoe Bay and the idea about moving forward with the development of TAPS, it also intersected with the rise in environmentalism. And so there became this concern, overriding concern about, well, this will scar the landscape and will forever change what is Alaska. It will ruin the environment. There'll be spills everywhere. It just not is a good thing to move forward, right? So there was lots of concerns along with that. It also intersected with NEPA, which is the first national legislation, the National Environmental Protection Act. It's the first comprehensive environmental protection act that was required in the United States. And so the intersection of those things caused lots of delays, if you will, we're not sure we're going to actually permit the building of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. So there was lots of concerns, protests, lawsuits, lobbying at Congress not to move forward. Well, that caused lots of, I would say, lots of interest in whether this would move forward. And for years, it was stalled, years. And then the oil embargo occurred.
Right.
And that had been brewing for a number of years.
And the price of oil increased by something like 4 times in a short period of time per barrel, just to give people an idea of how much of a shock that was.
Oh, it was a huge shock. This was in the early 70s. There were lines a mile long to fill up your car at a gas station. OPEC had decided not to import any oil and refined product into the U.S. So they basically exercised their control over our economies, if you will, and our lifestyles by saying, you depend on us a lot for oil,
Right.
We're not going to send it to you anymore. So that shot the price up. Shortages caused all sorts of disruption in the economy, in people's lives, and their quality of life. And that quickly turned around Congress, and within about a month and a half of those embargoes, they had finally approved the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act. And that was a story in itself. It ultimately was tied about whether to move forward or not, or whether they could continue with lawsuits. It was brought as an act of Congress. There was a vote in the Senate. It was tied 49-49 in the Senate.
Yeah.
And Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president at the time, cast the tying vote. and allowed it to move forward without any further lawsuits.
Yes, right down to the wire. So we have the authorization to build, and the laying of the first pipe took place in 1975, was it?
1974.
1974, okay. And how long did it take to get to laying that last pipe? What year was that?
That was in 1977.
Okay.
Yes. So it was very quick. As soon as the approval, it would never happen that way today. It could never move that quickly. But a lot of the materials were on site because they had been ordered before the big slowdown and all the concerns about moving forward with the construction. So it was really interesting. So in that period of time from 74 to early 77, when the last pipe was welded, and the startup occurred on June 20th, 1977. But in that period of time, it was really fascinating because you went from no infrastructure, no bridges across the Yukon or the Tanana, no road north of Fairbanks that connected to Prudhoe Bay, so 370 some miles, 3 major mountain ranges, 800 rivers and streams. There was just no airports, no infrastructure. So it went from that in 1974 to a construction of dealing with that type of infrastructure build out as well as the pipeline and the facilities. That was pretty phenomenal.
Oh, sure.
Going from zero to startup in about 3.5 years.
And the owners of the pipeline, they paid big bucks to the workers to do this. Could you tell us a little bit about how much money they were getting relative to other sorts of positions you could work at in the United States?
Well, it was a really good job. It was a really good job. Of course, you had to be away from your family. You're in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
You worked shift schedules. Sometimes you were up there for 3-4 months at a time before you got to go home. And the kind of wages that you could earn were better on an annual basis than what we paid our congressional representatives and what an NFL football player could make.
Yes, that's
So they were quite good jobs.
quite the statistic. And so the finished pipeline from the North Slope to the Port of Valdez, 800 miles or so? 800 miles, and it zigs and zags along the way. And there's a reason for it zigging and zagging. Could you just explain a little bit about that?
Well, the zigzag is really, this is why some people call it an engineering marvel, and it is in many respects. There's over 20 patents on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline itself. It's the first subarctic pipeline that's ever built. The zigzag mechanism is the above ground sections. They have a zigzag because you have to allow for expansion and contraction of the pipe. Metal expands and it contracts. Okay. And having zigzags in there allows it to move a little bit without putting stress on a straight linear straw. If you put a little bend in these things, it's almost like a little spring. And so that's probably the best way to describe it, is it allows that expansion and contraction, and similar to what a spring would do.
I see.
Yeah.
And the 800 miles of zigging and zagging, that pipeline, do you, or the owners of Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, do they own the land that the pipeline goes on top of and goes under? Do you own that land outright?
No.
Do you own any of that land?
Yes. So
yes.
So the land that we own, there's a few pieces of property that are owned. Where the Valdez Marine Terminal sits, it's over 1,000 acres. We own that.
Okay.
The TAPS owners own that.
Okay.
The Pump Station 1, where it sits up by Prudhoe Bay, there's about 300 acres that are owned.
Right.
And there's a few parcels in Fairbanks that we own. The rest of it is owned by federal, state, native corporations, and private landowners.
Do you pay any sort of a lease to any of these organizations?
We pay a lease to every single one of them.
Every single one of them, I see.
Yes.
Each independently negotiated, or do you
Yes.
negotiate with them as a set?
No, they're each independently negotiated.
I see.
Yeah,
I see.
so that was a big, securing the right of way across private lands, native lands, state lands, and federal lands.
Right.
There was complicated negotiations with state and federal, of course, but they set a per acreage fee and evaluation. There's all sorts of things that go in that. But probably just as complex was the negotiation with each of the private property owners. It's very significant. Took many years.
Yes. I wonder, was eminent domain used on any of these private property owners to get this thing built that you know of?
Not that I know of,
Yeah, okay.
but I wouldn't be surprised if there was at some point the eminent domain or the concern about eminent domain, and that ultimately led to settlement.
I see.
Yeah.
You mentioned the first pumping station at the North Slope. How many pumping stations were originally designed with the pipeline when it started service?
Very interesting. So originally the design was for 12 pump stations, and that got pared down to 10 by the time we were all done. And that was because there was some brilliant science going on at the same time with what was called a drag reducing agent. So it reduced the friction in the pipeline. So you didn't need as much mechanical horsepower to move because it moved easier because it reduced the friction. It was called DRA, drag reducing agent. And it's a chemical that you add to the pipeline stream, to the crude stream, and it allows it to move easier. It's a long chain polymer. I won't get into the chemistry, but the bottom line is it reduced the amount of pump stations that needed to be installed, and it reduced the amount of footprint that TAPS needed in order to move the oil from pump station 1 from the North Slope to Valdez.
I see.
Very interesting. Today, at the peak of our production, we were moving 2.1 million barrels a day. The pipeline was full. It was designed mechanically for 1.4 million barrels a day, but could move another 700,000 barrels a day because of DRA.
Which is DRA?
Drag reducing agent.
Okay.
Yeah, which we just chatted about, which is really interesting. Today now, we're moving about 510,000 barrels a day. And moving 510,000 barrels a day, we only need 4 pump stations. So we have 4 active pump stations today.
I see, I see. Yes, and we'll build up on some of these ideas as we go along. How does the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company fit into the Alaska economy? Would you say its role is critical?
I'd say it has a very important role in the Alaska economy because Alaska economy, if you think about our economy, we're getting more mature, and there is a bigger service component to our economy, and there's certainly a bigger tourism component to our economy. But the bread and butter of our economy is resource development. And I will say, from our perspective, and I think for anybody who explores on the North Slope or who delivers oil to market, it's responsible resource development. And so you think about what provides the jobs. It's 1/3 of every job in Alaska is due to the oil industry. TAPS itself, specific within that, is the only supply chain or access that gets that production that occurs on the North Slope to market, so it's monetized. Without the Trans-Alaska Pipeline or some other way to get those barrels to market, you wouldn't have this $2 billion to $4.5 billion a year of revenues that go into the state of Alaska. And I know that we're all dealing with issues today about what is the revenues we have and what's the government that we can support with those revenues. And so if you can imagine if you took the oil industry and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, which links the North Slope to the market, you took that out of the equation, how difficult those discussions would be, even more difficult than they are today.
Absolutely. Mr. Hendrickson, what components go into your calculation of a tariff? Do you have a standard published tariff, or are charges made on a customer-by-customer basis?
So the TAPS tariffs are actually, Alyeska's got a very different role and a very, I would say, a role that is not a typical company's role. We don't deal with the revenue side. So as I mentioned before, we're a privately held stock company, built to construct, operate, and maintain the pipeline, not to work on the revenue side. So the revenue side, the way the system is set up, is the owners compete against themselves. And this was a requirement, was worked out with the Department of Justice in the original design and construction of TAPS. So TAPS is a highly regulated asset. The owners are highly regulated. It is an oligopoly. It's not a monopoly, but it's an oligopoly. And what happened is they wanted to set up a mechanism where each of the owners had to compete to carry the barrels in the pipeline. And so what they would set up was you would develop your own tariff. You'd use a common methodology, but you'd develop your own tariff. And the methodology would describe how, when you took all the elements that go into a tariff, it created a ceiling that you could charge no more than X. You could always charge less than X. And if you were charging less, you could attract more barrels to your space. And by that competition, the theory was it would lower the tariff and lower the transportation. So with the elements that go into the tariff are things like, it's essentially your recovery of your costs and the recovery of your capital and a return on your capital. So that's really what it is in the big picture. Break that down a little bit. So covering your costs, like your costs for operating and maintaining the line. You get to recover that in your shipping costs. You get to recover your fuel gas supply. The North Slope provides fuel gas to run the first 4 pump stations. You get to assign a cost to that. And it's a regulated cost. It's like $1.20 an M, but it varies with the gas prices. You get to recover things like property tax. So when the state assesses a value on it, you get to include that in your tariff and you pass that cost on to your users. And then the capital that you invest. You get to recover the cost of that capital, so that's depreciation, and then you get a return on that, and the return is regulated. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who regulates interstate tariffs, which is barrels that go from Alaska outside of the state of Alaska. It's an interstate shipment. They regulate the tariffs that go on that, and they tell you what the rate of return you can recover. And then the barrels that stay within the state are regulated by the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, the RCA. And so that's intrastate shipments. That would be a shipment that says, comes from the North Slope, comes down to Golden Valley area, north of Fairbanks, in North Pole area, and goes into the refinery there. Those barrels are delivered in state, and so they're regulated by the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. Those that get on a vessel and go to the West Coast, those are regulated by the FERC.
And so we can understand how this is working. So the owners, like the current owners today, BP, ConocoPhillips, and ExxonMobil. So each of them independently will work within some sort of defined rubric to come up with a tariff that they will, in effect, charge themselves to use your services, the pipeline, that is. Are you consulted at all in this when they're figuring out how to cost this?
No.
So they do that independently. When you mention the rate of return that they're supposed to, that they're entitled to have, is there a formula for that, or can they independently, BP or Conoco or Exxon, set up what they figure is a suitable rate of return, and they need not match?
So maybe just a little bit about that. So where we are consulted is, what do you think it's going to take to run the pipeline? There's an operating cost component. And so that's where we're consulted. We provide the same information. Here's our budget for next year. Here's our forecasts for this year, where we think relative to the budget. So that's where we're consulted. That's it. So it's one piece of the tariff. It's an important piece, but it is one piece. Each of them has that information and then goes to their separate corners, if you will, and does the calculation about what is my rate of return on my capital. Now, where that so they do their own calculation, but the FERC and the RCA have said you can charge no more than X for your rate of return, and it's like 9%. 9% after-tax rate of return. You can charge no more than that. Each of them can decide: do I want to put in 8%? Will that attract more barrels? Will E&I ship on my space if I lower the tariff? Will Hillcorp ship on my space if I lower the tariff? If I'm lower than the next guy? And so then I make more profit that way. I make more of a return. I utilize my space better. So they independently make those calculations. And it's fascinating, actually.
It is fascinating, and you mentioned earlier how the Department of Justice is involved. So we're clear that the Department of Justice is involved because, as you mentioned, it's an oligopoly and there are concerns about antitrust. So we want to make sure that the pipeline ownership is not exploited on the part of the, for now, current 3 owners, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
And that
The
makes
Department of Justice is really involved in the beginning because that's when it originally brought when TAPs first started up, there wasn't a framework about how the tariffs would be calculated and structured. There wasn't a methodology. So each of the owners used their own methodology. They used common practice in Lower 48, but they all developed, there's different methodologies to calculate tariffs. So Department of Justice got involved in the very beginning. Since that point, it has just been the FERC. And the FERC has set the framework and the methodology that's used and the rate of return that's used.
All right. Apart from providing access to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, what other services does the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company provide to its customers and or the community?
Because we're so regulated, our primary purpose and almost our exclusive purpose is to move barrels from the North Slope to our connections. And I mentioned one at the North Pole. There's a refinery in Valdez, and then on to ships and to market. So that's our service. That's it. We can't provide other services. Otherwise we might, for example, we have power. We create our own power. Well, we're not providing power to the communities there and charging for it. Then we'd be regulated as a power utility. So if we charge for other services, if we provide other services, which we don't, but if we did, you would have to credit that back to the tariff, and it would lower the cost of transportation for everybody else. And it would also be subject to regulation in those areas.
I see.
Now, so we are exclusively moving crude oil from the North Slope to market. That said, what other services do we provide? I think one of the things we're very proud of is that we have a very engaged workforce that loves to be involved in the community, gives back to the community, very involved with United Way, American Heart Association, you know, the Heart Run that just occurred, the Heart Walk this fall, Go Red for Women, Athena Society. There are a number of boards and things like that. So we're very proud of what our employees do, and it's an important part of our culture to give back to the communities in which we live in.
That sounds very, very wonderful. Absolutely. Mr. Hendrickson, does the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company rely on any government funding at the federal, state, or municipal levels?
So directly, no.
All of your funding comes from the current 3 owners then,
Yes.
to service your needs?
Yes.
Okay.
So directly, no. But indirectly, I think we all benefit from roads that are well maintained, airports that are well maintained.
Yes.
So sure, we fly things in out of the Dead Horse Airport. It's maintained by the state and the feds.
Right.
Right. But directly, we do not have any subsidies from the federal, state, or local governments.
Okay. Mr. Hendrickson, tell us a little bit about your dealings with government regulations, federal, state, and municipal, how they impact your operations, and do you have significant environmental regulations to comply with?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're heavily regulated. Heavily regulated. So as part of the Right-of-Way Act, that was the approval to construct the pipeline, they formed a joint consortium called the Joint Pipeline Office. It's a mix of state and federal regulators, 21 entities that regulate Trans-Alaska Pipeline. We'll have on any given day between 50 and 70 regulators in our offices or on our facilities on any given day. So heavily regulated there. Those are things like the State Pipeline Coordinator's Office. It's the BLM. It's the Department of Fish and Game. It's the EPA. It's Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. So what they've tried to do is form, like I mentioned, called the Joint Pipeline Office, a JPO. They try to coordinate their regulation so they're not too duplicative, and at the same time are coordinated on what they're asking us to do, and they're not conflicting. So that's their effort, that is to try to coordinate their efforts with us. So there's 21 entities there. In addition to that, there's a Regional Citizens Advisory Council in Prince William Sound. And they're formed as part of an act, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And they're an advisory committee. We provide funding to them, but they are looking for ways to try and uncover risk that we might not be aware of, bring it to our attention, ask us to do things in a different way if they think it's too risky or it causes potential risk to the environment. So it's the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. We have a number of ad hoc boards and advisory committees that we have put together around the community that help advise us on how we're doing. And so we have a number of those. Those aren't regulators per se, but we ask for some people to come in and help us kind of open our eyes if we're not looking at certain things that they think we ought to be. So they advise us.
And the degree of regulation is such that any incident, however seemingly small, is documented and action is taken. So tell me if I'm wrong. A drop of oil drops out of a part of the pipeline and it lands on the ground. You folks jump into action when something like that happens. Is that correct?
We do. We do. We actually report any spill, regardless of size. We report it to the regulators. We track it. We go to root cause about what happened, and we report it to our regulators. So a quarter teaspoon hits the ground, we're reporting it. We go to great lengths to protect the environment. And so a lot of our vehicles, we have what's called a duck pond. When your vehicle pulls into a facility and it's out on a gravel pad and it's pulled up to a building, we have a duck pond. It looks an awful lot like, can I borrow this?
Sure.
So an awful lot like this. You park over the top of it, it's about twice this size, but your pickup goes over the top of that, and any drips from the oil pan will fall into this.
I see.
So it doesn't hit the ground.
Oh, cute name for it, duck pond. That
It's
makes
a duck
sense.
pond. So we do things like that. We'll do things where we build we'll put some 6 mil vapor barrier with some berms, some 2x4 berms or 2x6s around a generator that we're running in case the generator spits some gas or spits some oil. Now, so we take great care on that, and we spend a lot of time, energy, and resource doing that. What we're stepping back and looking at, to tell you how we're trying to elevate our game, is we are trading drips and drops that hit a pad, which is a gravel pad that we've created, for a solid waste stream. So we build all this 6 mil vapor barrier, all this 2x4s. Ultimately, when that project's done, that dunnage gets picked up and taken to the dump. So we're not sure we've got it dialed in right now. Those are the kind of things we're looking at. We're trading a drip here and there for a big solid waste stream. We're not sure when you look at from an environment standpoint, is that a net benefit?
Right.
So we're rethinking those type of things.
And speaking about regulators, from time to time you may find yourself in the room with your owners, BP, Exxon, and ConocoPhillips. Now, do you have lawyers in the room from time to make sure that the conversation doesn't push the edge of antitrust? Does that ever happen?
Well, absolutely. We have lawyers in the room every time.
Tell us about what it's like when you're having your discussions with your owners and how the lawyers sometimes have to jump in or when they jump in.
Yes. So what we do is just to set the kind of the context and set the scene. So we have frequent meetings with pipeline owners, the owners of taps.
Right.
And it's kind of a governance structure, right? They have a joint governance responsibility. And we meet with them on a periodic basis to review project plans, financial plans, risk, where we see risk and what we're going to do about risk, how the operations are going, things like that. Right. At the beginning of every meeting, we have a third-party attorney in the meeting who's one of the main functions at the beginning of the meeting, gives an antitrust reminder. You're allowed to talk about your joint interest in the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, but you're not allowed to talk about marketing or things outside of this. This is a discussion about how to operate and maintain the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. So very conscious of antitrust issues. And so that lawyer is in the room for the entire meetings.
That admonition from the lawyer, is that for the owners, or could that also be applied to you as the owned company? Could your companies potentially get to the edge of antitrust in terms of talking with the owners?
No, it's a great reminder for everybody. So we have information about who our shippers are, who's shipping on us, quantities, when it's going to be loaded. We're not allowed to share that information with other owners. So we could be a conduit for that information, and that would be inappropriate. So it's a great reminder for us as well.
Not only that, it is a fascinating application of business that's not often talked about in the business textbooks. And so this gets me to another question too about your current operations. Obviously, the throughput has been declining over the last few decades. Does lesser throughput make it easier or harder to run taps at this point?
It makes it very, very much more difficult.
Explain why.
Yeah. So the pipeline is designed to carry these higher throughput. It's not designed to be in these lower volume areas that we're seeing right now, which is around 500,000 barrels a day.
Right. And what is the diameter of the pipe, by the way?
The pipeline is a 24-inch pipeline, very large, very large. So what makes it really difficult, one of the things that makes it difficult is, so you built a pipeline for larger capacity, you have these facilities that are oversized now.
Yep.
Okay, so you're maintaining facilities that are oversized. One of the biggest things that comes with lower production is the temperature of that crude oil drops much quicker. It takes longer to get to Valdez, from Pump Station 1 to Valdez. Used to get there in about 4.5 days. It now takes between 18 and 19 days to get there. So it's got more residents. It's full, but it's moving slower.
Right.
And so when that crude oil temperature drops, when it starts to approach freezing temperature, the water, residual water that's in the crude could freeze, right? And it's very little amount of water. It's 0.2%. It's less than 0.2%. But it can accumulate around low points, and it can accumulate around valves and start potentially forming ice crystals. We don't want those ice crystals to interfere with the closing of those valves. Those valves are there to protect. So if we get an emergency situation, we need to close a valve, and there's ice there, then we are not protecting. So causes a significant amount of energy on our part, and time and resources and money. We're adding heat to the system. We're investing in heating capabilities and recycle at the pump stations to bring the temperature back up of the crude, and then move it on down, and it starts to dissipate, and then we'll bring the temperature back up. So it's much more difficult to operate the system when production's down at these levels.
And I understand that wax is also a byproduct that can form in the pipe as well?
Absolutely.
What causes the wax to form?
Boy, you gotta go to your chemistry class now. And so let me just try and hit the highlights without going into the chemistry of it. But essentially, wax goes through what's called a wax appearance point. And so as you take crude from warm temperature down to a lower temperature, it goes through a wax appearance point. And so wax starts to form, so as the temperature drops. And that causes some of those properties within the crude to actually form a hard substance instead of a liquefied substance. And so we actually run scraper pigs through the system. Right now we're running them every 6 days. We put a pig in the system, and what that does is it just scrapes any residual wax or water that might be in a low point and moves it on down.
Right. Okay. And yes, and that is a key term in your industry, in the pipeline industry, the pig.
Yes.
Tell us about the variety of pigs that you use. What are they used for?
Yeah. So the most of our pigs are used for what we call just a maintenance pig. And so it's scraping, keeping the pipe walls clean, not letting water settle in a place, not letting wax settle. Really important from a long-term maintenance standpoint to do that. What happens, if you think about corrosion, what happens is when water starts to sit and pool in one place, and some of the microbes in there start to eat away at the metal. So by running a pig through it, you move it on down. You don't let it sit there and start to take hold.
What is the frequency of running these pigs in the current system?
We run the maintenance pig every 6 days.
Every 6 days,
Yeah.
I see.
We're looking at increasing that frequency. We don't think we need to do it that much. We've got now 42 years of experience. We don't think we need to do it every 6 days. We haven't made that decision. We think we can move it out to, say, every 9 to 12 days. It certainly, there's risk when running a maintenance pig too. It's not risk-free. You're opening up the system. You're in a controlled way. You're breaking a pressure boundary. You're going to launch it. You put it in the barrel. You close it up. You launch it down there. Pigs can get stuck. If the pipeline has a shutdown while the pig's there, it gets stuck. How hard is it to get it moving again? So anyway, we're looking at frequency there, but essentially we run those every 6 days. Those are maintenance pig. We also run what we call an ILI pig, which is we call it a smart pig.
Okay.
And what that does is it takes readings. It's got instrumentation. It takes readings on the thickness of the wall of the pipe. And it's got thousands of instruments along the outside of it as it goes down the wall. And so we get these readings all along the way that tell us, is the wall thickness degraded? And we look at that data. We're using artificial intelligence now to help us sift through that data quickly. And then those that meet a certain threshold get on our radar screen, and those that meet a higher threshold, we might actually go out and say, we need to dig this up and find out if what we're seeing on the instrument pig is actually there, and if it is what we think it is, it might need a repair. Might put a sleeve on it. So if you saw, it's a 1-inch thick pipe, for example, if you saw 3/8 to a 1/2 inch of corrosion, you'd say that's getting too close. We got a 1/2 inch left. That's still a fair bit, but it's getting too close. We might dig it up, put a sleeve on there.
You call that an ILI pig?
Yes.
What does ILI stand for?
Don't ask me that, Darren. I don't know.
Oh, so it is a, let's call it
stumper.
a technical term. I will ask you this though, do you own these smart pigs?
We do not.
They are leased or rented to you?
Yes. Yep.
And why is that? Cost saving or because those are rare things?
Yeah. Yeah, we run an ILI pig every 3 years. So it's not enough for us to want to own it. The companies that we rent it from, they will come up and they'll do a run for us and through the pipeline. They might be here for 2.5, 3 months, and then they go off someplace else around the world and take that smart pig with them.
I see. Yeah. Well, what does the what is the cost of your cleaning pigs on a per pig basis?
Those cleaning pigs, our maintenance pigs, run about $100,000 apiece.
$100,000 apiece, and I can imagine then that the smart pig is multiple times more than that.
Yes, I think if you were going to buy a smart pig or commission one to be built, it's in the 10 million to 15 million.
I see. Very, very expensive. How do you measure success in your business? Does your company use any key performance indicators?
There's lots of ways to measure success, but we and also measure things that aren't progressing the way you expect them to, right? Yep. So yes, we use key performance indicators extensively, and at the very highest level, you have things like what is your safety performance, and break that down. It's like occupational safety. Break down occupational safety. How many first aids? How many times, and then within first aids, how many times did they have to go visit a medic for that first aid? 1, 2, or 3 times, or more. Right. If there's injuries that result in what's called a recordable incident from an OSHA standpoint. So those are more severe incidents, a chipped tooth, a broken arm, something that needs stitches, something that needs to be removed from your eye with a specialized pair of tweezers. Those are a higher level of an injury. Those are called recordable injuries from OSHA's standpoint. And then there's injuries that are like lost time injuries, where somebody's hurt so bad they can't go to work the next day. So that's just an example of KPIs within the occupational safety arena. We have financial performance indicators. We have key initiatives, milestone indicators. We have reliability indicators. What's our reliability and uptime? Did we have to shut the pipeline down? And very proud to say over like the last 7.5 years, our reliability has been over 99.9%. It's important. It's one of our key metrics.
What about the finance? Do you have are your key performance indicators on the finance side pretty much standard what you'd expect in other companies, or do you have something that's unique?
I think there's not a lot of magic in the finance side or the operations side. It's the same thing as anybody else would, but you would bring, the biggest thing you can do is bring visibility. From a leadership standpoint, bringing visibility so people see how they're doing and then can make decisions based on that. Most of our financial indicators, not all, most of our financial indicators, you start at the top. What's the total spend? Break down the total spend between capital and expense, and then breaking down the capital into the projects and by area, breaking down the expense by who owns that budget. So those are not magic. That's probably pretty similar to most people. We have balance sheet reviews I do every month with our controller. And so we're looking at our assets and what's been placed in service, what's not been placed in service, what's our inventory levels, what's our property, plant, and equipment, what's our cash on hand, those type of things. So very, very similar to what other companies would do. I think the big thing is trying to bring, as I mentioned, bring visibility to those things. And giving people the tools to be able to assess how they're managing it and whether there's an opportunity to increase the support and attention in a certain area.
Are you required to report to your owners on a quarterly basis your overall financials or annually? What's the...
Yeah, we report monthly. Yep,
Okay.
we report monthly. And of course, there's quarterly reports that goes out to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as well.
Okay.
But yeah, we're on a monthly cycle.
All right.
Now, most of our financials, as you would imagine, are backward looking. Not all, but a lot of them are backward looking. What did you book? The forward looking are what is your forecast going forward? What is your budget going forward?
Right.
So you marry those things. You know, you've got to marry what I know and what I expect.
And I would think that your owners share with you their output forecasts from the North Slope, so you can figure out what kind of throughput to plan for in the coming years. Is that correct?
Yes, there's lots of coordination that goes on between Trans-Alaska Pipeline and Alyeska and the producers about what are we expecting from Prudhoe Bay over the next week, the next month, the next 6 months. What are we expecting from Kuparik?
Right.
What are we expecting from Milne Point, Endicott, Alpine? You bet. Lots of coordination there, and a lot of coordination with the shippers. When is your ship going to get here?
Right.
How many barrels can you take? And so there's lots of, because there's only so much inventory available on taps, storage, if you will. So what can happen is happens, at least once a year, is there'll be a jam in the shipping schedule. Weather, refinery turnarounds, ships that go to dry dock to get repaired. And so the inventory in Valdez starts to build. And then you have to say, well, if we don't get a ship in here, we're going to have to slow down the pipe.
Right.
So lots of coordination on that. And so we look at, as part of KPIs, we look at inventory levels, projected inventory levels, shipping schedules, lifting schedules, producer input, so their input into taps. So a lot of those things are evaluated and spend a lot of time and energy on KPIs, key performance indicators.
Yes, that gets me to the Port of Valdez. Do you own the storage? Does the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company own the storage facilities there? Are you in charge of those?
Yes, we're in charge of them. They're owned, all of the assets are owned by the TAPS owners.
Right.
So Alyeska manages and operates them.
Yes.
But BP, ConocoPhillips, and Exxon own them.
They own them. So you manage the storage capacity there. Do you also manage the dock and the berthing of the super tankers as they come in and out?
Yes, we do.
You handle all that. What is your storage capacity at Valdez right now?
It's about 7 million barrels. Yeah.
And as you were saying, there are from time to time it could be just backed up, and we just have to wait for the ship to come in, right?
That's right.
Absolutely. How many berths are there for these tankers at Valdez?
Well, so we have 4 berths, but only 2 are in operation anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's due to the declining throughput over the years.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And we were talking about milestones earlier. Certainly the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 was a milestone that brought about other sets of regulations as well. So you have to manage the regulations now dealing with the super tankers coming into and out of the Port of Valdez. Could you say something about some of these regulations?
Yes. So very dark chapter in the industry's history. Good Friday in 1989, the Exxon Valdez hit Bly Reef and spilled 11 million gallons of oil into Prince William Sound. Very dark chapter. Yeah. And we think about that every day because sometimes you have to remind yourself of your worst day to make sure something like that never happens again. Mm-hmm. So since that period of time, there's lots of regulations that have gone in place and lots of things we've done voluntarily. What happens today is that each tanker, laden tanker, is escorted by 2 escort tugs. And one of them is tethered to the back of the tanker. So the tanker's underway and the tug is in tow, so to speak. And the purpose is, and it's not really towed, it's matching speed. Mm-hmm. The purpose is if the tanker loses power and starts to continue to move towards an obstacle or the shore or a rock or reef, that tug is already tethered and can immediately arrest the tanker. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things. And then you have another tanker that's there on side that can provide additional propulsion and move that tanker. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that we've done since 1989. It's part of the regulation and part of what we're required to do. Mm-hmm. We have booming capabilities. You have materials that if there is, as a matter of fact, when we push a tanker up to the dock, to the berth to load, we put a boom around it. Mm-hmm. And that boom, what that does is if anything spills, it's already contained within that boom. It's not going to get outside of it. Right. So it's not going to get to the beach. It's not going to get soiled. It'll be contained within that boom. So we preemptively boom every tanker. Mm-hmm. So we spend a fair bit of time and energy. Our serves operation is in the neighborhood of about $140 million a year. Mm-hmm. And about 90% of that, 80 to 90% of that is on prevention. Mm-hmm. It's like having a fire department there.
Exactly.
It's prevention. It's not anything to do with docking operations. That's the other 10 to 20% is just the normal operations.
And I seem to recall the tanker operators themselves, they are now required to be using double-hulled containers into and out of the Port of Valdez, another part of the regulations since 1989.
The marine side of the business has changed as well, yes. Mm-hmm. And double-hulled vessels, dual propulsion systems, dual pilot houses, there's all sorts of regulations on their side of the business as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's it like being on the leadership team at the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company? Could you walk us through a typical day on your job?
Yes, so it's actually a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And certainly there's a level of stress that comes with any job. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's unique to anywhere in the world, any type of job you have. Mm-hmm. But it is a lot of fun. So what we do in many cases, so as you can imagine, at the executive level, there's quite a few meetings. And so most of our meetings are to review performance, to set direction or redirect, make sure that the vision, that we're still following our vision, and we've got, what are our priorities towards reaching that vision. So there's a lot of performance reviews. There's a lot of what's our plans next? How is this particular project going? What are we doing to transform with technology? How are we trying to make things simpler? You know, and I think one of the things that we've uncovered, we've adopted a new strategy recently, and our new strategy has kind of got 4 pillars. It's like we've made things really complex for a reason. It was important to do that, but going forward, we need to decomplex a little bit. So let's keep the controls in place. Let's be tight. Let's make sure we guard against lackluster performance, but maybe we don't have to do it in the same way that's overly complex. Let's give people more authority, more empower. Instead of stopping work, let's see things after the fact, and if something's out of whack, I'm going to go address that one item instead of trying to sheep dip the entire organization.
Absolutely.
So simplify. One of it's transform with technology, is to bring on new technology, exploit the technology we have. Some great examples of that in history that we've gone through. Recent examples we've used, we're the first crude oil pipeline in the country to use a robotic crawler pig. And basically on facility piping, so that's facilities in buildings, around the buildings, we opened up the pipe and we sent in a crawler pig that basically was like on tracks, and it would move through the pipeline very slowly, and it would take measurements of the thickness of the pipe and would tell us if there's a potential corrosion problem, so then we could go look at it. Absent that, you'd have to just cut it all out and replace it every X number of years, because you wouldn't know whether it was good or not.
Right.
800 miles of pipe, you can be good for 799 miles and all but the last inch. Well, that 1 inch, if you have a spill, it's a big problem.
That's right. What was the diameter of the pipe again?
48 inch.
48 inch, and that is a rare diameter for pipes around the world, correct?
Oh, it is.
Very unique.
Large, yes.
Large and unique for Alaska.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nothing like it in Alaska. So that transform with technology, the simplify transform with technology, high performance organization and culture, developing our people. We have great Alaska hire, 95% Alaska hire, and we try and hire really good people, and then we try and develop them.
Yes. You also have an annual internship I should give a plug to as well. We're certainly happy about that. You've hired a few of our graduates over the years. We're very proud of them.
A number of your graduates, Darren.
Yes, we're very proud of that. Absolutely. Looking into the future, Mr. Hendrickson, what would you say is the biggest challenge facing the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, and what is its biggest opportunity?
So really, I think our biggest challenge is we've built this phenomenal engineering marvel that really is a benefit to the state of Alaska. It's a benefit to the United States. It's a piece of national strategic infrastructure. It's protected by the military. We work closely with the FBI. I mean, it's an important infrastructure for the United States. Certainly an important piece of infrastructure for the state of Alaska. And we have tremendous talent in this state. And we get to hire great people from UAA. And what our biggest challenge will be keeping the pipe full. That's our biggest challenge. How do we do our part to keep the pipeline running safely, environmentally responsibly, reliably, and cost effectively?
Right. To put it in perspective, what's the current throughput again per day, barrels per day?
About 510.
And
510,000 barrels a day.
What would it have to get down to before you'd say we are really at a crisis moment and it's time to consider the functionality of this pipeline? What would that number have to be down to roughly?
I think that's a debatable. It's all on economics, right? If oil price was $1,000 a barrel, you could probably go lower.
Yes, yes.
But I think somewhere in that 200,000 barrel a day. Now, I wouldn't quote me. I'm not an engineer on this.
Okay.
The engineers would look at it. But I would say we're in a mode that ought to draw a significant amount of attention. God's gift to Alaska is resources and natural beauty and the fish and the timber and the oil and gas. And so what we need to do is find ways to do our part on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and with Alyeska to help make sure people still have confidence that oil and gas can be developed responsibly in the state and delivered to market responsibly. And so we do our part. Our opportunities are to continue to do a really good job on the safety, environmental reliability front, do it cost effectively, all of those things cost effectively, Because today, Alaska is competing for investment dollars with North American shale.
Right.
And we have a lot of advantages. We are a super basin, which means we have a lot of oil and gas here. We have infrastructure that a lot of places don't have. Our infrastructure is built out. We have talent, right? We've got people who know what they're doing, have been here for years. But we have a disadvantage. And our two disadvantages are we're a long way from market. It costs about $9 or $10 to get it from the North Slope to the West Coast. If you can imagine finding something in Texas where the refinery is 100 miles away, it doesn't cost them that much.
Right.
So we're competing for those investment dollars. And so we need to do our job to try and keep our costs prudent, at the same time delivering high quality services, safe, reliable, cost effective, and environmentally responsible.
And that $9 or $10 was $1 per barrel, right?
That's right, it's $9 or $10 per barrel. So when oil is at $60 a barrel, 50 of it's just to get it to market.
Right.
That's not counting getting it out of the ground.
Right.
And separating oil, gas, and water, and sending the oil into the Trans-Alaska Pipeline.
Sure. So do you foresee the possibility of throughput going up in the next few decades, or is it basically a matter of maintaining position?
I see it, so if you believe the Department of Revenue and the Department of Natural Resources, who do forecasts twice a year, they do projections.
Right.
If you believe their forecasts, which I do, dutifully, no, which I do, I believe it, we're going to see an increase in production.
Okay.
And we should. There's more and more oil being discovered up there, new technologies applied, and so we should see an increase. Now, there's things that could inhibit that. A crash in oil prices, a dramatic change in the tax structure, in the take. If the federal and state government decide they want a bigger share, that's going to make investment look less attractive.
Right.
So, or costs go up on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, costs go up in the facilities. So if it becomes non-competitive with other places to invest, then people aren't going to drill wells up here.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company and the owners, it's part of your mandate to, when and if the pipeline ever became functionally not effective, you have to tear down the pipeline. That's part of the business plan. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit about what that requires to tear it down.
Well, we call that dismantlement. Dismantlement, restoration, and reclamation, DR&R. And so it's mandated in the right-of-way agreements that when you're done, you're going to take the assets out and you're going to restore the land. So what does that look like? We've got a couple proxies. So we've done that to a couple facilities that we've taken down, disconnected it, revegetated areas, replanted. So we kind of know what that looks like in very small, isolated test case. We don't really know what it looks like until we get there, because the way the regulations are written, there's an individual position within the BLM that gets to determine what does that look like. So for example, the above ground stuff is pretty easy. Restore it to its natural condition. Will the regulators say, well, all the below ground pipe, you went under that river, you need to find a way to pull that pipe from underneath the river? That's going to look and take a certain amount of effort. That would be very different than dig down a few feet, clean it, purge it with nitrogen, cap it, leave it in place, because that's does less environmental disturbance than the other method. We don't know what that'll look like. We have guesses about it. We have estimates what it might cost to dismantle the pipeline, but those are all at this point kind of very far off projections. We're hoping that's 50, 60, 70 years in the future.
From a financial perspective, are any of the costs of that built into any of the calculations on your side or the owner's side? Is there a fund for that should the day come decades ahead?
So there is. So as a matter of fact, in the tariff itself, the original construction of the tariff, you're allowed to recover your expected dismantlement costs.
I see.
Well, that amount in 1970, probably been $1977 was estimated at about $872 million for dismantlement. So the way the tariff methodology was developed was you can recover $872 million and no more. So the TAPS owners have already recovered that.
Oh.
So they've collected from shippers. Some of that's them paying themselves, some of it's from third-party shippers. But they've already collected that in the tariff. So the tariffs going forward, the methodology that's approved by FERC going forward doesn't include any of that.
Okay.
So they've collected everything they can for the future dismantlement. So now it's at risk. In $1977, did they collect too much or too little?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good economics question, and also another unique business application too, because this is an example of a owners basically financing the eventual liquidation of one of their assets, which is a very interesting case study. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us as we study the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company?
What I really just say is first, thanks for the opportunity to come chat with you about Alyeska and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. It's got very, very unique governance structures that are set up. It's a unique asset because it's regulated differently than a lot of assets in the state of Alaska or anywhere around the country in many ways. And it's also iconic for the state, and it's important to the state. And I just maybe add one other thing that, sometimes I think about, particularly with my kids have now gone through high school here and graduated from college and are off making their way. The importance of having good companies to work for that are that having a higher purpose, and the higher purpose of this is important for the state, it's important for the United States, it's important for our communities, but we also think about it's really important for our employees and our contractors to have a job that makes a living wage, a good wage. Why is that important? Sometimes we forget about that. What that does for your self-esteem, what it does for your family, what it allows you to do to sit on boards, to give to charitable organizations that have interest, to have great performing arts center and great parks. Those are the kind of things that come out of having a good economy and having good jobs that you can move into. And I think part of our future is continue to make sure we do our job really well so that all those things can happen for people, for the state, and for our country. And when those things are in place and we do our job well, hopefully that sets a framework for moving forward where people feel confident and continuing to invest in the state of Alaska, continuing to allow drilling to occur on the North Slope and production to occur on those North Slope. I think it's incredibly important. So we're really proud of what we do. Like any executive in any company, we're really proud of what we do. We're trying to always be better. We're always looking for new talent to come on and help us see things that maybe we're not seeing, bring new perspectives. So we're excited about what the future holds.
Very fascinating discussion, Mr. Hendrickson. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank
you.
you.
I'm sure you'll agree that the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company plays a critical role in the Alaska economy and beyond. Thanks for watching.
Visit us at business.uaa.alaska.edu.